No guides!
Over the past decade, Forza Horizon hasn't just grown to become the premier open-world arcade racer series, it has become one of the landmark technical showcases for what the Xbox family of consoles can do. Forza Horizon 5 is the first new game in this series to release for Xbox Series machines, but as the racing heads to the open-world rendition of Mexico, Playground Games has also had to design this game with the Xbox One and the PC in mind. So how does it hold up? Is this game hindered by the last generation, or is that last generation just hopelessly compromised in order to let the game push on to new heights? Well, to put it simply, Playground Games has absolutely knocked this one out of the park. The game either looks incredible, or it runs impeccably at a performance target, or it manages to do both. But having said that, there are several signs here and there for why the Xbox One generation will soon be getting left behind. Let's start off with the high end though, the Xbox Series X and the default graphics mode. This, quite surprisingly, runs at 4K with a target frame rate of 30 FPS, which obviously isn't going to be the go-to frame rate for racing fans. But because of this, Playground Games are able to really push those graphics quality settings. And it still feels really damn good when racing at 30 FPS. This is a series that has always aimed to get 30 FPS gameplay feeling good, and this is probably the best that it's managed yet, thanks in part to the excellent and very natural feeling motion blur in effect. The visual fidelity is simply sublime, and especially when you're racing through tight and cramped settings such as a jungle, you will be hard pressed to spot when and where the game engine is using lower quality assets or fading in higher quality ones. The dense foliage on trees, for example, almost always looks like it's being rendered at its highest quality. It's only really when you get to the broader open spaces that you will start to realise that yes, there is actually some pop-in the distance for ground foliage in particular, and when in the open world, car detail will often pop as well as you get close to NPC vehicles, for example. Switch from 30 FPS to the 60 FPS performance mode, which unfortunately requires a full game reboot, and you will immediately feel this difference. Playgrounds state that this is still running at a maximum 4K resolution, but that, and I quote, additional graphics settings are adjusted to maintain target frame rate. In practical terms, the most noticeable aspects here are that motion blur is dropped way back down, giving it a much more clean and gamey feel. Maybe the lighting is now less refined, and most noticeably is that pop-in is now pretty much everywhere. However, it is also just that much more responsive feeling when you actually play the game, and after a short time at 60 FPS, a switch going back to 30 FPS feels like you're getting daggers in your eyes. The great news is that whichever mode you choose to play in, you are getting pretty much perfect performance. I've barely noticed a single hitch while racing around this world, so yes, you are choosing to make compromises to the graphical settings, but once you get into the game, the experience is flawless. We don't have an Xbox Series S to test for this video, but from prior reporting through Digital Foundry, it does a great job of meeting similar visual targets to the Series X, just doing so at a lower resolution. For the game's launch on November 9th, Playground will be pushing that target resolution in the quality mode up to 1440p instead of 1080p, and then you still have 1080p 60 for the performance mode. So what about the last generation? Well, first impressions are mixed, and this comes from the opening intro montage of racing action, which has become a staple of the Forza Horizon series. You start off dropping from a plane into a volcano and get to take in some of the incredibly broad scenery that Forza Horizon 5 offers as you race down the side of this. And the game looks great on One X and pretty decent on original Xbox One as well, both able to hit their identical 30 FPS targets. The snag comes when you hit the first transition point. On Series X, this is an instant jump from gameplay to cutscene and back to gameplay in a completely different part of the world. But on both Xbox One consoles, it cuts to a black loading screen. You'll be like, what is going on when you see this? And it happens on 3 occasions during the intro. We've timed this first instance at 37 seconds on both Xbox One machines when running from the hard drive, and because it cropped up, we then chose to load the game up onto an external SSD as well. That does still leave you with blank loading screens, but the wait that you endure drops to 13 seconds on Xbox One and 9 seconds on One X. Out of curiosity, we also booted this up on PC with a traditional hard drive for the game to run from, and there's no loading gap. To be fair, the PC has got bucket loads of RAM in it to use, but it's still a stilted effect on Xbox One, and it's not entirely clear why that's the case, for reasons that we'll come back to in a moment. Thankfully, the rest of the game lives up to expectations. The Xbox One X targets 4K, and it looks absolutely fantastic. Honestly, I'd put it up there with the Xbox Series X for how the game's art style and general fidelity feels and comes through to you as you're playing, and it really shows just how good this console still is. Unfortunately, where Forza Horizon 4 gave One X owners a 1080p 60 mode, there's no such option here. I really hope that Playground can go back and add that in down the line, but perhaps there's a CPU limitation that means that it's not doable this time around. If it's a business decision so that the series consoles are the only ones with 60 FPS, that's a real shame because the One X deserves to be treated as the powerful console that it still is. The Xbox One, though, is clearly the runt of the litter. The game still gets its graphical intent across, but the detail scaling really shows this console's age. As you race through jungles, you'll notice that the tree foliage stays in that blobby low level of detail up until you're almost right on top of it. So you get this pretty close-up view of the tree detail loading in, and then it's immediately past the camera. Honestly, it feels like the game engine shouldn't really bother trying to put in those high detail assets. The gameplay still holds up though, and frame rate in this situation is going to be the most important aspect, as well as the responsiveness of the simulation and the car handling. But again, we have to come back to the loading times and the effect that a spinning hard drive has compared to an external SSD on the game. Loading into the game, it takes a whopping 2 minutes and 27 seconds for the Xbox One to go from hitting start to your car appearing in front of your house. That's 1 minute 44 for the Xbox One, which is able to power through this loading time a little bit more. But switch them both over to an external SSD, and that load time drops down to 41 seconds and 38 seconds respectively. The Series X, well, that's doing this in around 19 seconds. Of course, all of this is without taking into account that there's a pretty lengthy load to the title screen in the first place, and that when you do actually load into the game, you are then presented with menus at your house before you can drive into the open world, and there could be like a black screen loading there as well. There's a lot of time needed for that initial load process on the Xbox One in particular. Once you're actually into the racing, loading doesn't feel so intrusive. Fast travel is down to 10 seconds or less on all configurations. It's even at just like 4.3 seconds on Series X. And loading up a race is disguised a little bit by having something actually happening on screen as it's going on. And this brings me back to that intro. Why is it that you can fast travel across the world and it takes about 10 seconds, but you can't disguise that load by the cutscene in the intro? It's a very confusing issue, and again, hopefully it's something that Playground are able to come back to and fix shortly after release, because after a while it won't really matter, there won't be that many new gamers. But all in all, Forza Horizon 5 is another graphical masterclass from Playground Games. On Xbox Series X you have a choice between 30 FPS and 60 FPS that can actually be a little bit tricky to make given how good the game feels with all of the effects turned up. Then you have Xbox One X, which actually stacks up surprisingly well, even if you miss out on having a 1080p 60 option as you had in Horizon 4. And even on the lowly Xbox One, it can deliver a decent experience. However, what I will say for the last generation is that if you are playing this game, then do try to play it from an external SSD to help crunch down on some of those loading times. That's all that we have for this video, but this is coming alongside our full Forza Horizon 5 review, which you can find on the sixaxis.com in written form, or I've got a YouTube video up for that as well. Before you go, make sure to like, subscribe, share, click the bell icon, all of the usual YouTube things, and hopefully we will see you again soon. Goodbye!